Let's now talk about what makes a candidate profile competitive. Are there any questions right now before we continue? Seeing none, we will move to what makes a candidate profile competitive. Look, let me ask you guys something. You're a New York firm, you have 220 spots, let's say, to hire people. What's going to be your biggest differentiators between a mediocre candidate and one you want to take in? And you've got like 10,000 applications to go through. What heuristics are you using to whittle down the pile as quickly as possible? Let's get some thoughts around this. Okay, so Ella says grades. Jasmeet says grades or experience. What else? Leadership skills, says Jordan Shear. Great. Demonstrated interest, says Charmaine. Yeah, don't waste my time. Don't tell me you've been in government and saving the planet and working with like the not-for-profits and suddenly you care about US securities regulations. I need somebody who's willing to do the job, who's interested in doing the job, who has a track record of interest that they can demonstrate, because this is grueling work. If you don't love it, it will crush you. Cameron says areas of expertise. Yes. So let me ask you something. Let's say you did come from a government background, or let's say you have limited work experience in corporate areas. Let's say you're one of those people who didn't catch on to the fact that New York was going to be looking at all this, and you just focused on grades and didn't do much in the way of leadership or extracurriculars. What are you going to do now? Because a lot of people forget that the only reason you're in law school is, in fact, to land a job. But you're not always prepared for that reality. You go in, you think this is an academic exercise, and most people don't realize that the day you walk into law school, your application is being built. Your networks are being built, your resume is being built, your work experience, your leadership, your extracurriculars are being built. And that is what you're going to have to use to land your job. So what if you missed the boat? What if you didn't sign up for the legal clinic or the moot? What if you didn't get on the law journal or law review? What if your grades are more middling and you don't have a track record of corporate work experience? How do you get around it? What are you going to do? Because let's be honest, most of you have one of these areas lacking, if not more. By no fault of your own, some of you just didn't know. Others were strapped because you had to work part-time to pay for school. Others maybe didn't have the mentorship available. What are you going to do if you don't have the grades, leadership, demonstrated interest, or work experience? Okay, Sherman, I like this idea. Networking and connections. Okay, you got to get somebody to buy into the future vision of you. So if you don't have something in your past that you can point to, you got to make a compelling story about how you're going to make up for it in the years remaining in law school. Look, mea culpa, I don't have any corporate work experience yet, but I've signed up to work at the business law clinic next year. I'm taking exclusively corporate classes next year. I plan on, running a side hustle or starting a business to demonstrate my entrepreneurial skills to pay for school next year. So you can be future looking, number one. Number two, that networking piece. Really getting somebody to buy into the quality of who you are, even though you're lacking some of that experience. What else? What else are you going to do to compensate for some of these gaps? Me sitting here and telling you what New York is looking for is not going to solve the problem of you not having some of this. So let's talk about it. Any hands up? Anyone want to speak out loud instead of just dropping it in the chat? How are you going to tell New York that you're the real deal if you can't show it to them? I want you guys to be prepared for this because they are no nonsense. When you get to the interview, they literally do not have time, given the sheer number of applicants, to sit there and take a chance on someone they're not sure about. You've got to work with what you have. Any ideas? Apart from networking, apart from making commitments about what you're going to do looking forward. It all comes down to this one thing. You have to have a reasonable explanation for why you didn't do it. If you didn't have a corporate job, if you don't have leadership experience, if your grades are middling, do not think for a second that you get to just roll past that. You have to explain with as reasonable a set of factors as possible why that was the case. Talk about the fact that you are a first-generation student who didn't have mentorship around you, and that's part of the reason you've struggled, but here's the things you're doing to improve on that. Talk about, the family situation that meant that grades were a bit of an issue in your first semester, but that you're picking them up, and here's how you're doing it. Talk about your public interest background and how it left you wanting that as much as you enjoy giving back to the community or working for government, that there's an intellectual ceiling you hit, or that your potential you realized would be capped. And that's what's inspired you to look on the corporate side of things. Talk about how you flew down to New York or networked with people. And that insight is what's feeding your drive to apply to them. Be honest, own the deficiencies in your resume, and then explain how you're going to make up for it. Because they are technically hiring you before you've even entered your second year. So you've got 2 more years before you actually go and work for them. Talk about all the plans you have. Talk about the self-awareness piece. Talk about and own your past, but be willing to provide reasonable explanations for why you've changed career trajectories. Do not skip past it. Do not bury it. Do not disown it. And don't bullshit them either. They can see right through it. They respect honesty a lot more than making excuses. So I'm asking you to provide explanations, not excuses, and then proactively explain how you're going to make up for the deficiency. Cameron.
How much of this should be sort of front loaded in when we're first sending out resumes versus when we're actually getting to the point of being able to network, go to coffee chats and stuff like that?
Yeah. So depending on what the deficiency is, you may want to warm the bench, is what I call the strategy. You may want to speak to people, associates, and partners ahead of time, offer this explanation, and then have one of them submit your materials to HR for you. And we'll talk about that, because what it says to like, if it goes straight to HR and you've spoken to nobody, HR will look at purely at the resume, at the transcript, and say not up to par. But if a partner forwards HR your resume and says, this is a good candidate, I've spoken with them, asterisks, we need to interview them, it will skip past the HR vetting process. HR will take their instructions from the partner and say, we're going to interview you. And then you get a chance in the interview to explain. So warming the bench is really about getting somebody on side to vouch for you, so that some of these obstacles to interviewing you are already skipped over. But if you have super strong grades and just a weak corporate experience, you may not need to warm the bench as heavily, because your grades will speak for itself. There are plenty of people I know with very limited corporate backgrounds who have ended up with multiple offers in New York, but they had strong grades. So if it depends on what the deficiency is. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
The level of networking and bench warming you have to do will be inversely proportionate to the weakness of your application. Weaker application, more networking required. Stronger application, not as much networking required, but still networking is important. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about this. Networking is important where grades, for example, are deficient. So that's why grades is seen here first as the #1 requirement. It's the easiest way when you're vetting through 10,000 applications for 200 spots to figure out who's worth your time. So a top tier candidate is going to be one with distinction or honors, somebody who's won a course prize or who generally has an A average. This will be your top 10% or dean's list in the class. A tier 2 candidate has a mixture of A's and B's, okay? Ideally B+ average. Eligible and competitive for most firms. Some firms won't take you. Most firms will look at you. A tier 3 candidate has the straight B curve average, okay? There's nothing really interesting about them from a grades perspective, but they perhaps have strong work experience to compensate for it, good extracurriculars, and strong networking skills. These candidates still have a shot at the vast majority of firms. If, however, you are deficient both in grades, work experience, and extracurriculars, you'll have a very challenging time getting a firm to look at you, and will absolutely need to double down on the networking. If you do have a failing grade or an academic offense on your transcript, this is going to be nearly impossible to overcome. So you can probably still land New York with, say, a C, provided you have a good explanation. But if you have a bunch of D's or fails, or a blacklisted course on your transcript because there was cheating or another academic offense, it's going to be really hard to come back from that. In those cases, by the way, if you have a failing grade or a C or something else on your transcript that is going to hurt you, you may want to consider appealing this or petitioning to rewrite the exam, pending extenuating circumstances. And we can talk about what that grade appeal would look like. I've helped a number of students in the past who've had medical issues or have had family issues or have had undiagnosed ADHD or depression, or something that interfered with their ability to do well. And several of them have landed afterwards in New York. So it's something we can look at. The second thing is relevant work experience. Now, relevant work experience doesn't just mean corporate transactional work experience. Anything with reasonably transferable sets of skills is going to be helpful to you. So for example, if you started your own business and you learned entrepreneurial skills that way, that's huge. If you weren't paid for a position, it was a volunteer position, say at a legal clinic, but you advised small businesses on how they can start their enterprises and all the regulatory requirements involved, that can be helpful too. So work experience can be paid or unpaid. It can be at a formalized corporation or something you started yourself. It could even be a research assistant with a professor, such that you can speak to your research and writing skills, because that's extremely important at a law firm. So think about skills rather than just titles. When it comes to work experience, think about paid and unpaid. Any job that demonstrates grit is also looked upon favorably by firms. This can include blue collar work. If you've got, long hours doing manual labor, working at a restaurant, customer service, anything that requires you to step up, work long hours, and grind it out is going to be attractive to New York. At the end of the day, regardless of what work experience you choose to highlight on your resume, make sure that it's demonstrating skills that New York is going to value, that you can take initiative, you can be resourceful, you can adapt to changing environments, you can rise to the occasion when new problems are presented to you without needing to be handheld. And most importantly, that no matter what job you are given, you add value above and beyond what anyone else in the same position would add. You go the extra mile. You are the change maker. You are always the MVP. That's the kind of mentality you want to go into your resume crafting with. It was mentioned as well by you guys in the chat that extracurricular involvement is looked upon as part of your
taking pictures of it.
Sorry, we're just going to mute anyone who's unmuted can mute. Awesome. So the other thing to, think about here is the extracurricular involvement, because it's part of how you demonstrate your track record of experience, okay? Now, in the United States, if you get onto law review, that's actually a very big deal. It's quite prestigious, and law review is something that you don't just sign up for, you technically have to apply for. It's usually reserved for people who have demonstrated, who've gone through like an application process, have provided written examples of their written work. They have to provide their transcripts, and they even get interviewed. So when a Canadian student says, I worked on Western University Law Review, Faculty of Law Review, or the Queen's Law Review, or U of T Law Review, it actually looks really good, because it makes it seem like you are on par with those students in the US who are on law review. So it's quite prestigious, and something that is easy for us in Canada to be able to do, because you just sign up for it. So if you haven't done law review, consider signing up for it next year and put it on your resume with bracket forthcoming 2024. If you did do it in your 1L year, absolutely make sure you mention it. The second thing that firms look for are any participation, if not on law review, in legal journals, because it demonstrates your prowess in legal research and writing. This also includes if you've done any research assistant positions for professors. If you've also published anything, even if it was from undergrad, please make sure you include it. Formalized journal publications also speak to the strength of your legal research and writing skills, or research and writing skills generally. Legal clinics are looked upon very favorably as well, not necessarily because it related to the subject matter of what you'll be doing at a firm. You could have been doing criminal defense, housing and tenant rights, or family law, but the fact that you have client-facing exposure and you've dealt with real-world issues and you've managed case files from start to finish is an actual advantage that firms look for, because it's a specialized set of skills that you would have gained. Please also make sure that you cite and mention on your resume any oral advocacy work you've done, whether that's mock trials, mooting competitions, or client counseling competitions. These are really important, because whether you're on the transactional or litigation side of a firm, you will always need to be a strong advocate for your clients. The last part for extracurricular involvement involves student leadership. You can mention club memberships, but ideally it's the leadership positions you want to focus on. So that includes student council, executive roles on any clubs, if you're a board member of any activities inside or outside the school, if you're a president of the society, editor of a journal, or if you've been the head organizer of a conference or charitable event, you'll want to mention those. I see a question from Guy.
Yeah, I just had a quick question when you're talking about like our participation in law review and stuff like that. If we've done like an externship or a clerkship in that matter, and we're um, cited as an author on a decision or like contributed to a decision, should we be making a specific notice of that and the name of the decision, or kind of just leave that?
I don't think you need to be that specific, but what I will say is that the clerkship is absolutely going to go on your resume. And you'll be able to list several bullets, and we'll get into that in the resume section momentarily. But in the set of bullets, what you can do is talk and describe the cases you worked on with the judge. I don't know that you need to cite specifically what decision you were a co-author on. You can. But if you do, I think that it should be secondary to the overall work you've done. And then if there's spare room at the end, you can cite that decision specifically. So it's not a hard and fast rule about whether you do it. It's more, what would it take the place of if you were to put it in there? Because you can always speak to what decisions you were co-authoring in the interview process or in the cover letter. In the resume, it should be a lot more about the general skills rather than being overly specific, if it's going to take away from something else to make a case for yourself. Guy, the answer to this will become more clear when we get to the resume section. So it's not a yes, it's not a no, it's a what would it come in the place of? That's the better question. And if there's nothing else that's taking the place of, put it in. If it's taking the place of something else that's actually more important for the case we're building on your unique value proposition, then we don't want it in there. And we'll talk about what a unique value proposition is and what a strong resume looks like. Any questions on the extracurricular side? Okay, the last one is maturity and breadth. I want to drive this point home. New York is not child's play. How many of you are aware that the whole idea of not having articling places a disproportionate emphasis on your level of maturity from day one? Is it clear to everyone that when you're not an articling student, you have a higher level of responsibility and a higher standard to rise to? Is that clear? Thumbs up. When I say that there's no articling, this isn't just a metric around pay. It's an indicator that you are expected to be a grown adult and a professional from the day you walk in through the door. The Canadian legal system has articling attached to it because historically, under the British model, law was seen as an apprenticeship profession. What that means is that your training was not considered to be complete unless you had spent at least a year being supervised by a lawyer who could observe your work. You're still considered a student under the articling model. In the United States, you are not a student, you are not a junior, and you would be held to the same standard as a 5th year, a 6th year, or 7th year associate. You are a first year, fully fledged associate upon entry. What they don't want are children walking in who are not self-aware, do not have strong emotional regulation, have poor communication skills, and don't understand that what you say, what you do, and how you behave is a direct reflection on the firm. You are hired and fired at will in New York, and you are utterly replaceable. So if you want this job, if you want one of the 200 spots that they have for associates out of the 10,000 applicants on average that apply per firm, you are going to have to explain to them why you are not a liability. That means maturity, breadth of exposure. You know what it is to be in the room with the CEO of ExxonMobil. You can carry yourself well at dinners. You won't engage in inappropriate conversations or inappropriate relationships with other associates or with the client. You know when and how to say no. You have a good sense of your own emotional boundaries. You know how to get a job done, and you know how to prioritize and multitask. Maturity and breadth aren't throwaway words. They are a minimum requirement for you to do this job because of the level of responsibility you will be expected to match the day you walk in through the door. This is the big leagues. It is not training exercise. It's not camp. I don't care how fun the summer feels. You are being watched. You are being evaluated. You are being vetted from day one. And let me be very clear about this. A bad first impression is almost impossible to come back from. So one of the things you are going to have to convince them of is that you are not a 20-something-year-old kid who has no concept of what they're walking into. How do you explain and defend the fact that you have maturity, self-awareness, breadth, and depth? Talk about your travel exposure. Talk about study abroad programs you've done where you've had to get dropped into the middle of a situation with a completely different context you didn't understand and how you thrived. Because getting dropped into a new deal with a new client in a new industry you've never done before is like visiting a foreign country. There's an entirely new language around the industry. There's a new set of people you're going to have to integrate with. There's a new corporate culture of the client you'll have to be able to fit into, and you're going to have to adapt very quickly. Talk about the language skills you have that make cross-cultural communication a breeze for you and the competencies that come with it. Talk about the volunteer or charitable work experience that demonstrate your civic mindedness or your ability to not just think about yourself, but about the community in which you operate. A good deal doesn't get closed unless the team has a healthy working relationship. So explain how you're mindful of those environments when you're in them. Talk about prior advanced degrees that have matured your thinking and your reasoning skills. Perhaps you did a JD MBA, maybe you did a JD MPA, public administration degree, or an MA in economics or history before you started. These are common ones. Talk about how that matured your level of thinking. Talk about how you've overcome adversity in life and you don't take the opportunity to work in New York for granted. Talk about the learning disability you were diagnosed with and how you overcame it. The fact that perhaps you were a refugee to Canada or the first generation in your family to even attend university. In my most successful interviews in New York, I straight up talked about how my grandmother was illiterate and got married at the age of 13 in a village in Malaysia. I talked specifically about how she wanted more for her daughter than she had, and therefore my mother, unlike her peers, actually got to finish high school. And that when my mother finally had me, she wanted more for me than she had. And so I wasn't just allowed to finish high school. I did 4 degrees after that and made it to Wall Street, despite growing up in Scarborough at the poverty line. That's what I told them, and that I wouldn't take any opportunity I got from the firm for granted, and I would work every day to earn my spot. When they saw that I wasn't afraid to own my past, to talk about the fact that I was an immigrant outsider from day one, but didn't let that stop me, and that I stand on the shoulders of the women who have come before me and who have sacrificed for me to be there, literally, I got an offer on the spot from more than one firm because they saw the conviction I had. So I don't want you to shy away from the journeys you've had. I don't want you to hide your background, your ethnicity, or the struggles you've gone through. Use them as your superpower to convince the firm that you've got that maturity, that awareness, and the appreciation for the opportunity you'll be given. I want to tell you guys something. The reason New York is looking increasingly more toward Canada is because the reputation we have on Wall Street is that we don't take it for granted. Canadians don't walk into the firm with a sense of entitlement that sometimes the Ivy League students exhibit. I'm not saying everybody, but sometimes there is an air of entitlement that people who come from privileged backgrounds or who expect to get jobs on Wall Street have. A lot of Canadians go in with kindness, compassion for their colleagues, grit, the ability and the desire to demonstrate what they offer, and they pave the way for future candidates like yourselves to come into the firm with the benefit of the doubt. Every time a Canadian has gone to New York and has been tested, we have risen to the occasion. So we have a really good reputation in New York for being people who earn their positions and who don't take it for granted. So use that narrative that's already in the minds of these employers. Tell them that you're hungry for good work and good training and that you will do everything you can to step up. Because that's a narrative that's already in their minds. Is that clear? New York isn't the place to pretend you're one of them. It's the place to say you're willing to do what it takes to become one of them, and you've got the skills to do it. So that's maturity and breadth. Yeah, Cameron.
Would you say it's worth emphasizing that difference in background coming from Canada, or if we have experience in the US or in New York, should we be striking a balance between exhibiting that we have both?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. The question will always come up, both in the preliminary stage interviews and in the final round interview, why do you want to be in New York? And that you can approach from two different angles. The first is I have familiarity with New York. I understand the market. I've been here. I went to undergrad here, whatever your connection to the city is. But when they ask you then why this firm, which is another major question, not just why New York, but why our firm, that's when you can relate your background to the firm's culture. I know at Kirkland and Ellis, you value people who are scrappy, gritty, who hit the ground running, are willing to be resourceful, and don't make excuses when the going gets tough. Let me tell you about how my background has given me that. So you can use your background as a demonstrative set of facts or evidence that supports a culture fit, while your New York experience can support the answer to the question, why do you want to come to New York? Does that make sense? So use it strategically. Borrow from all areas.
Gotcha.